First of all, let me thank all of those deputies who rose to support the motion put forward by People for Profit and Solidarity in support of the students and midwives, and our call that they should have the healthcare assistant rate that they were given earlier in the pandemic restored, that more generally they need to be paid for their placements because it is work, it is not simply education, and the fact that they have to pay fees for the privilege of being exploited on the wards and working on the front line, not just in COVID, but more generally playing a role in holding our entire health service together on an ongoing basis, is an absolute scandal. An absolute scandal. And I really want to say, and I don't say this lightly, the absence of Minister Donnelly, the Health Minister, for a debate about thousands of student nurses and midwives who have protected us all, put themselves in harm's way, fought on the front line during this pandemic, is nothing short of an insult. The Minister's speech earlier on, which was almost at the realms of fantasy in terms of depicting the reality of student nurses and midwives' work and role in the health service, was an insult. The government's amendment to our motion is an insult, and it really all exposes as the purest hypocrisy and as totally hollow and disingenuous all of the applause, all of the praise that the government parties heaped upon student nurses and midwives earlier in the pandemic. Because with this decision to refuse the request of student nurses and midwives to pay them for their work, you have shown that really that all meant nothing. And the first point I want to make, Ceann Comhairle, is this is a direct breach of a promise that was made by the Taoiseach himself on October the 20th, of a commitment. Because I raised this issue on foot of conversations with Phil Hay from the INMO, who brought it to my attention, and then thousands, literally, of student nurses and midwives who contacted me, and I've held Zoom meetings with them and so on, and I raised it with the Taoiseach and said it was completely unacceptable that the healthcare assistant rate that was given to student nurses and midwives at the early part of the pandemic, under pressure, it has to be said, from those student nurses and midwives and their unions and so on, he said yes, it should be restored in that debate. And he has since rolled back on that, and now we get this amendment with really outrageous excuses for breaking that commitment and refusing to pay the student nurses and midwives and show them the respect they deserve. Minister, your government's arguments in the amendment are threadbare. They could be summed up as saying your refusal of this payment is justified on the ground that COVID is not as bad as it was in the early period of the pandemic, that you are protecting the nurses' education, that's why you're not paying them. I mean, it's almost Orwellian in its doublespeak to suggest that, justified by the great improvements apparently you're making in staffing levels in the hospital and supposedly reducing the dependence on the student nurses and midwives to hold wards and healthcare settings together. And of course, the other excuse is what wonderful opportunities there are for student nurses because of reforms and improvements you have made. Now, rather than me go through why I think your amendment is nonsense, disingenuous, hypocritical and fanciful, let me just quote one of the hundreds of nurses who've posted on our Behind the Masks online campaign recently, who've written in to me and who've attended meetings. But this is Zara, because she directly read your amendment, and I just want to read what she says, because she covers most of the points. I would like to say that the point the government are making in this amendment is an absolute joke. I'm a second-year general nursing student, I just finished a 2-month placement last week. While I was in placement, there was 1 staff nurse and myself for 12 patients on multiple days. The ward did not bring in a HCA to work in that area as there was a student there. So to say there is safe staffing and that it is protecting our education is an absolute joke. And we are expected to work with COVID patients for free. Whilst I was on placement, 3 wards in the hospital had COVID outbreaks and were shut down. 100 staff had tested positive for COVID in my hospital, and my ward was turned into a COVID ward. So for the government to insinuate that because there are lower hospitalisations than in the first wave, that there is no risk of us working with COVID every day for our education is laughable. She also points out that most student nurses and midwives do not even get the miserable €50 allowance for accommodation, which in any event wouldn't go even next to near covering the cost of accommodation. As one student nurse put it, it wouldn't cover the cost, literally, of a cardboard box. You could pay that much for a cardboard box. Or let me give you another heart-rending story of the many that I've received. I won't mention a name in this case. A lone parent with 4 children had been homeless during her training. In 3rd year, during COVID, did her unpaid placement, had to give up her job to do that placement, and has subsequently had to drop out of her nursing course because of the cost of fees. She also got COVID-19. Now, this is just scandalous. It is shocking beyond belief. Let me read some more. Anya, we are not there purely for education. We work 13-hour days as part of the team, taking on our own case loads to cover staff shortages. If you stepped foot in any public HSE hospital in Ireland, you would see this for yourself. We should not be used to replace staff nurses if we are not paid. And the stories just go on and on. So I do not know who wrote the minister's speeches. But as Anya said, clearly that person is either deliberately misrepresenting what is going on at the hospitals, not just during COVID, but all of the time, pre-COVID, in terms of the roles that student nurses and midwives are playing. And as I'm not sure if it was this Anya, but it was certainly an Anya at one of the online meetings I had with the student nurses and midwives, who said, oh no, it was Sarah, who said, when I am finished my training, I would not work for the HSE in a fit. I'm leaving. And one after the other, the nurses and midwives said that. And the survey the INMO did in 2018 bore that point out, where more than 70% of student nurses said they intended to leave or were likely to leave because of the terrible conditions, because the experience of burnout. They also pointed to the direct impact of the work that is imposed on them during the education as contributing to that burnout, and then the conditions they have to face as nurses when they are qualified. And of course the emails that you received today that have been mentioned about the €100 registration fee for the Nurses and Midwifery Board, to be again asked to pay in the midst of a pandemic for the privilege of going in and working on the front line, endangering their health. I mean, these truly are insults. And is it any wonder that we had an enormous strike of nurses and midwives over the issue of the inability of the HSE to retain nurses and midwives, that we need desperately, and we now need more than ever in the face of the pandemic, that they are leaving in their droves because of the terrible conditions they face? And that they have to pay $3,000 to $7,500 if they'd previously done another degree in fees for the privilege of being exploited. It is shocking. And there is no doubt, as many of those student nurses pointed out, if this was a majority male profession, they would not be treated in this way. There is a deep gender bias in this treatment of student nurses and midwives and their exploitation, and it has to end. And I can tell you, Minister, the government and the government parties have engendered the fury of tens of thousands of not just the nurses and midwives themselves, but of their healthcare colleagues, over the treatment of healthcare workers and student nurses and midwives in their treatment of those healthcare workers during COVID and more generally, and with this insulting amendment. So I would appeal to you, withdraw it. End the exploitation, pay student nurses and midwives what they deserve for the critical role they play, treat our healthcare workers properly, and stop making them pay for the privilege of providing society a service and our healthcare a service by imposing extortionate fees on them.
Thank you very much.